So welcome to the art of telling and selling, the ABC of communicating our message effectively. I've called this telling and selling because it's not only the art of storytelling, but also in this day and age, how to sell our stories, how to persuade people that they're worth reading. So in this presentation, first of all, we're going to start with why tell stories. Now that might seem a fairly obvious point, but the thing is, I want to stress why tell stories versus giving information. And the thing is, we live in such an information age that we sometimes forget the power of stories. And there's a craft to putting together a good story which is worth learning. And the other reason for starting with why tell stories is I want to model good practice, which is always to start by selling or persuading your audience why it's worth them investing their time with you. The next point, what makes a good story, that's really an overview of what makes a good story as opposed to just sharing information. The third point, the basics of story structure, that's going to be digging into that story structure a bit more. And in the second part, I'm going to just give you a suggestion of how you might write your story. There's no right or wrong way here, this is just a suggestion which I think works for me, which I hope you'll get some useful information from. So let's jump into the first part, why tell stories. And a few quotes here. Storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today. And I think that's very true. And another quote here, if stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. Something I've realized is we are actually creatures of story. Scientific observations of children younger than 2 years old show that story structure is actually hardwired into our brains at an even deeper level than language. We start constructing stories for ourselves even before we can talk. And these stories give rise to our beliefs, and our beliefs give rise to our emotions and behaviors. Here's another quote from Anthony de Mello this time. The master gave his teaching in parables and stories, which his disciples listened to with pleasure and occasional frustration, for they longed for something deeper. The master was unmoved. To all their objections he would say, "You have yet to understand that the shortest distance between a human being and truth is a story." Stories are very, very important. In fact, we have another quote on our website somewhere from the great South American educator Ivan Illich, and he was once asked, what is the best way to change society? Is it through violent revolution? Is it through gradual reform, through democracy? Or is it through education? And he replied, it's none of those things. The best way to change society is to tell a different story, to tell a better story. And it really is because stories determine the way we see the world. And if you change the way we see the world, you actually change the way we behave in the world. So stories are very, very powerful. So hopefully by now you're sitting at the edge of your seats, eagerly anticipating the next part of the presentation. And this is really where you should be in terms of story structure, because that's the job of the introduction. That's the job of the first part of a story, to get you to that place where you're kind of sitting comfortably and just waiting for the story to begin. So, we're going to jump now into the basics of a story structure. It's really quite simple. It goes like this. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now you might be saying, what? Is that all there is? Have I spent my time on this video just to see something as simple as that? Well, there is a bit more to it, and we'll jump into that now. So we'll start at the beginning. And the beginning is really, really important, because the job of the beginning of the story is to actually sell the story or persuade your reader to carry on. Now, you as the writer, you know that you've got a valuable story, you know that it's a great story, but your reader doesn't yet know whether this is something that they should spend their time reading. And the fact is, in this day and age, we are competing against a whole lot of other information. We're constantly bombarded with information, and frankly we're bombarded with a lot of people trying to sell us something, people trying to persuade us to give our attention to them. And some of those stories that are out there will not be as good as your story, but if they're better sold, if they're better advertised, then your reader will go to those stories instead of your story. And I think people spend less and less time now deciding whether they want to read something. Perhaps in the past, before the internet, when there was less information available, people were more willing then to read the newsletters or whatever it is that came in the post. But now my guess is that they will decide in less than 10 seconds whether they want to read your story. So you've really got to grab their attention right at the start. And part of how you do that is by covering this basic information. All stories should answer these 6 basic questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. There's a great quote from Rudyard Kipling, who was first of all trained as a journalist. He said, "I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I know. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who." And I'm quite surprised how many stories come to me for publication on the International IFC websites which don't answer one or more of these questions. It's really important to cover these basics. Now, which do you think is the most important question out of these 6? Just spend a few minutes thinking about that. If you answer why, then you're correct. Why is the most important question, and particularly in terms of selling the story right at the beginning. To answer why, you need to think, why is this important? What problem in society is this solving? How does it make people's lives better? If you can begin to answer those questions, you're well on the way to actually gripping your reader's attention from the start. And remember, you might need to give some background information about those problems in society before you can really answer that question, especially if you're writing for an international audience, because they might not know as much about the situation as you do. So you might need to give a bit more information to help them understand the context, understand why it's important. So really, at the beginning of the story, your job is to write a killer first paragraph, something that really grabs the attention. And if you do this part well enough, then the rest of the story could be actually badly written and people would still read it. They'll make the extra effort to understand what you're trying to say if they think it's important enough. And I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to get your first paragraph really gripping and exciting and selling the rest of the story. Now, I'm going to come back to this point a bit later on in the presentation with some more ideas, some more possible ways that you can get people's attention. So after the beginning, you come to the middle. Now, this is the main part of the story where you actually deliver what you've promised in the beginning. And in the middle, the most important thing is to give direction. It's as if you've persuaded your reader to come on a journey with you through the woods. You've promised to show them lots of interesting things on the journey. But if there is no direction in the middle, then the reader might get lost and they might decide they don't want to continue on the journey. Again, I'm going to give you some suggestions on how to create this sense of direction, some possible structures later on in the presentation. And finally, we come to the end. This is where you've finished your journey and you need to find some way to signal that this is the end. Again, there are various ways you can do this, but I suggest that the main thing to think about is, what do you want the reader to take away with them? Okay, so now we've covered the very basics of story structure, and I'm going to give you some suggestions about the process of writing a story. The first thing is to start a list of all the bits of information that you want to include. Now, you could either use a pen and paper and make a simple list, or you could use a mind map like this one here. By the way, if you want a free mind map, there's a program called FreeMind, which is very, very good. It's what this is produced in. If you look it up on the internet and download it, very good program, very easy to use. I think that mind maps are a very powerful way to start getting the information out of your head, to start to actually put it down on paper. You can think of this as a brainstorming exercise, and here the aim is not to worry about structures or nice words, but just to list as much of the information as you can. And be sure in this part to include those 6 questions: the who, what, where, when, how and why. So for example, in this mind map you're starting off with the main idea, and the who is Jane and John. So Jane, you've got her story, you've got what she says. John has a different perspective. Who else is there? How many people? What kind of people are they? And then you come to the what. How are things before the situation? How are things after? What changed? And the where. And there may be something significant about the place. So think, what do I need to explain about the place where this took place? The when is fairly obvious, but the why. What problems were solved? What were the benefits? And then what were the benefits of the benefits? Sometimes it's like peeling away the layers of an onion. It helps to actually dig a bit deeper before you come to the real benefits, the real point, the real why of the story. And finally, how. What was the process? What challenges had to be overcome? What unexpected help came? And how did people have to change to make it happen? Now there are probably lots of other questions you can think of, but this might just give you some ideas of how this mind mapping process can help you to actually get down all the information that you need to tell the story. And as you do this, you'll probably find that you actually need more information. And the internet is a great tool for research, even at the basic level of things like, have I spelt that person's name correctly? Have I got his correct title? And just a word of warning, as you look things up to fill in the gaps of information that you need, don't rely on just one source, even if it's Wikipedia. I made this mistake a while back. I was editing a story which mentioned a famous person, but it didn't include his official title, so I looked him up on Wikipedia and used that information. Unfortunately, in this case, Wikipedia had got it wrong. So even Wikipedia isn't infallible, so use 2 or 3 sources wherever possible. And remember, a writer's brain is like a magician's hat. If you're going to get anything out of it, you have to put something in it first. So now you've got all your basic information, and at this point I suggest that you might write the middle first and leave writing the beginning until you've got to the basic story structure written. So how do we write the middle? What's the structure here? Here are some possible ways in which you can arrange information. The first one is the most obvious, and that's in chronological order, in order of time. So first this happened, and then something else happened, and then after that something else happened, and finally that happened. It's easy, it's something which we're all familiar with. It's how the universe is structured, and therefore in most cases this will be the one you use. Few other possibilities, and sometimes these can be combined. The second one is the tower. This is where you have a stack of numbered or perhaps bullet points where each point of information builds on all the previous information. So you're kind of building up a structure of information and knowledge. Third point is what you might call the ping pong. This is like a dialogue or conversation where you have 2 different points of view. So you might start with one person's story, the first story, and then meanwhile somebody else is having their story, and then you jump back to the first story. So you're kind of ping-ponging from one side to the other. And lastly, there is the very ancient structure, the melodrama. And if you look back at our ancient myths, they will often have this sort of archetypal story structure where you have the hero who's having their normal life, and then something happens, there's some challenge, and then the hero and the situation are both changed. And so play about with these different structures. As I say, most of the time you'll be using the chronological structure, but bear in mind the other possibilities as well. And as you're writing your story, it's very important to put in lots of signposts, and these are to show your reader which way through the forest, if you like. And signposts are things like bullet points or numbered points or new paragraphs which start with words like soon after that, or next, or shortly before that. Even asking questions which the reader might want to ask, things like, why did she do that, you might ask. The answer is, and then you write your answer. And just remember that your poor reader has not been on this journey before. They don't know the road, so give them lots of help along the way. And once you've got your story structure clear, then you may be able to see the core of the story. Now, the core is a very important concept, because once you've clearly understood the core, you'll be able to communicate that information clearly to other people. So what is the core? The core really is the heart of the message. It is the few words which summarize what your story is about. Every successful story has a central premise, a central core message. For example, in Shakespeare's drama Romeo and Juliet, you could say the core message is great love defies even death. The core is what gives your story direction, simplicity and power. Some examples of cores. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. The core of that is the idea of economic justice for all. Mahatma Gandhi's Quit India speech. The core of that is insisting on non-violent independence. Or Winston Churchill's famous We shall fight them on the beaches speech. The core of that is the idea never give up. So think about what is your core. Once you've done that, once you've got the core, this is when you can go back and write the very beginning of the story. Remember here what your job is. It's to write that killer first paragraph, and having clarity on the core will really help you with that, because to write that killer first paragraph you've got to have some of these things. You've got to have clarity. You've got to have the whole story of what happened summarized in 3 or 4 sentences. It's got to be relevant to something topical or to a major problem. Relevant to the reader. For example, how an ordinary mother changed her community. People can identify with that. You could follow this route, which is a little bit unusual, but that's the intriguing mystery. For example, what do President Obama, a sailboat and a lame goat have in common? I don't know, the reader asks, but hopefully they're intrigued enough to want to read the story and find out what these 3 things could possibly have in common. Don't be careful with that one. Don't overdo it, because it's got to be genuine. It's got to be it's got to not feel like the reader's being conned. Okay, so remember again, the main thing here is to sell your story. Persuade your reader that yours is a great story worth reading, because you're competing against many other messages which are also being told. And finally, we come to the end of the story. This is probably the thing you'll write last, and the thing to think about here is, what is the message you want your reader to take away with them? What action would you like them to take after reading your story? It's a delicate balance, and don't be too moralistic here. If possible, let the people in your story have the last word rather than you as the writer telling them what they should think. Let the story speak for itself. For example, if your conclusion is in the words of one of the people in the story who says, reflecting on these events, I've concluded that blah de blah de blah, that's much more powerful than you as the writer saying the moral of this story is blah de blah de blah. But here you really need to find your own style, as in all writing. I suggest you look at the endings and the beginnings of other stories that you read on the web. Which ones do you like? What don't you like? And have a think about why it is. And finally, get lots of practice. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. The more you practice writing stories, the better you'll get. So good luck with your story writing. I'm looking forward to seeing lots of your writing appearing on ifc.org, and thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.